Welcome, everyone. Delighted that you're able to join us this morning, at least here in Boston and in New York and in Vermont. It's a wonderful opportunity, and I think the first that we have had to explore the amazing art of Gunnar Norrman. We're grateful to Mara Williams, who is a curator emeritus of the Brattleboro Museum, and particularly to Andy and Dominique, who have been our bridge to Gunnar's work for at least 3 decades, if not 4. What an opportunity to be together and to both honor, remember, and I think share stories. The event today will also include some film clips from a film and documentary done on his work in 1987 by Erwin Leiser. There'll be some photographs, which are quite wonderful and bring back wonderful memories. And finally, those of you who received the catalog notice that we included some poems carefully chosen to go along with the work. For oh so many years, we've titled the exhibitions that we've been able to do, somehow including the word poetry, the poetry of nature, the beauty of silence in nature, a variety of titles, all of which point to the enduring astonishment that we call this show, that we all feel, I think, when we're privileged to share the work of Gunnar Norrman, and I think of Ulla Norrman as well. And she needs to be certainly included on so many levels in this experience. Many years ago, Sue and I were privileged to visit with them in Malmö. They were already well along in years, probably 15 years older than we were, and they took us to some site they wanted to see that was up a substantial hill, and they were running up, and Sue and I were panting up. They really were people who were engaged with the environment around them in such a beautiful way, and proud of it, and proud to share it. So in part, this is an opportunity to share that experience of the joy of knowing both of them through the art that he created and she created with him. So the cover of the announcement, namely of Gunnar, if we can see that, Caroline, if you have it, if not, we can start with the thing itself. That's it. I think it's just a nice way to welcome all of you into the world. These are clips, the photographs are taken from the film, I believe, and then just one image. But to see Gunnar placed in nature, working in nature, and after a period of time becoming a part of nature, and then its messenger is quite wonderful. And then he in the studio inking the plate, and in the center, just one of a number of very, very beautiful pieces. I do want to, before we start, say thank you, all in capital letters, to Andy and Dominique for their generosity, for their cooperation, for the sense of allowing us to share his work for these many, many years, and to have done it with such integrity and friendship. So thank you, thank you, thank you. Let's move on and look at the first piece if we can. And then there's a clip that we're looking at first that will provide a sense of place for everyone. Andy, do you want to describe a bit of where he is?
Behind their house in Lund, which is a suburb of Malmö, they had this enormous garden, which was almost as much a preoccupation of Gunnar's as was his art. He spent endless hours there, and it was phenomenal. People would come from around to see it. And, you know, he was devoted to it.
No.
As he was to all things natural. Dominique?
So what comes to mind when I see the photo is how selective Gunnar is in his art. You see the garden view, and it's full of green, nothing stands out especially. And you see that Gunnar has a very quite respectful, almost Buddhist admiration for nature, and that he very carefully selects what he wants to show. And it's not just a portrait of his vision, it's a portrait of his feeling about nature.
I would also see that it's a sense that he is at home in the space that he has created. And in that home, he has invited, as we saw, that hummingbird into the space that is safe. And that there is a mutual respect, I guess, that comes from simply watching it. I remember sitting in the yard as he put out a little food for a hummingbird, and it came and perched on his hand.
Yes.
And it was just this kind of extraordinary moment for someone who grows up in an urban environment to see this connection that he had that was so genuine and so very real. So let's begin with the first of the drawings. Many of you know that we'll be looking at dry points, pencil drawings, and charcoals as we go through. And this is the first of a number of pieces we'll be seeing, this a pencil drawing. Andy, did you want to talk about it a bit?
I was going to add to the nature stories just an anecdote or two, which is that there was a seagull named Erwin who would appear on the same day, year after year, to come and be fed by Gunnar. And he even tamed some hedgehogs patiently over time to come and eat from his hand. So this is a pencil drawing, rather early. And of course it's botanically perfect, but it's it's pretty self-evident, but anyway, he starts you see the top first, and then these slim connections to the ground, and there's some kind of harmony to it that strikes you immediately, I think. You can see some of his processes, which you see both in the drawings and the prints. He loves to darken the upper corners to emphasize the frame of what he's depicting. Dominique?
Well, I think a lot of Gunnar's work is a study in contrast. You have the very, very slender reeds, and then you feel the heaviness of the seeds, hanging onto those very delicate reeds. And a lot of his work is a sharp contrast between very delicate lines and very strong blacks, which of course can be much best rendered with dry point.
Yeah, it's hard to get those blacks with pencil, but
yes,
you get the idea.
So Mara, we're going to look at the next one and ask if you would respond to it, if you don't mind.
Well, what I am interested in as I was going, and thank you very much for the beautiful catalog that arrived at the museum. I picked it up this week. What I was interested in, this is a larger piece. The first one was a very modestly scaled 8 inches, but it had a monumentality to it. I felt like I was entering as if I were a little ant looking up. I was in such a small, compact space, only 8 inches. I felt this sense of scale. There was a complete delicacy, and yet it felt monumental to me, the grass. And this one, it's the sense of quietude in his work that really draws me in. He really uses an economy of means to render a 3-dimensional world and scale of a 3-dimensional world in a way that's utterly believable for the person viewing the work. And as Dominique said, the delicacy, even the depth or the darkest tones that he's getting, there's a delicacy of touch with everything that he does in all the different media that is quite extraordinary.
Agreed. There's a quote from Brother Thomas that I was looking at today. The more sublimity you experience, the less there is of you, the more you share of others.
Beautiful. I mean, beautiful thought from brother, but
it's also the sense of looking at his work that comes to mind exactly. When you use quietude, sublime, astonishment, enduring, poetry, all of those feelings, responses come up in sharing his work. And Andy and Dominique, it must have been for you, these many years of friendship that nourished you, but at the same time, the work itself provided you with an extraordinary amount of pleasure.
Both. Both.
So there's a lovely photograph next that we'd like to share, and if you'd talk about it a bit.
Oh, sweet.
I love it.
Well, I affected that hat at a certain period, but Gunnar, you can see how pleased he is to be out in the countryside. That's up near West Point with the Hudson in the background.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know, I think our friendship shows pretty clearly there. But he's such a serious man in his art and his music. And in life, he was constantly trying to enliven or make jokes. Or, just a pleasure.
Well, I never knew him, of course, but several things strike me just looking at this picture. A is this a sort of really sense of gusto, but when you reflect back on the first image we saw of him feeding a tiny, tiny songbird a little piece of almond with these giant hands. Look, I mean, look at the scale of his hand.
Point out the right hand there.
Yes.
So, he obviously was a hiker and an outdoorsman, and he toiled in the soil, and yet, shoo, the tracery of branches that were, he could render, and the delicacy by which he approached a bird. It's a study in contrast in this sort of remarkable man.
It's wonderfully said. Go ahead, Anne, sorry.
And there was I said Buddhist before, I don't know what he was religiously, but there was a freshness and a purity of spirit that was a joy to be near.
It's too bad he didn't know Brother Thomas. They probably would have formed a real bond.
It's true. I think the privilege for us is obviously just having their work in the gallery, sometimes side by each, and allowing people the opportunity to certainly share in that. I also wanted Mara talk about his hands, because I remember first shaking hands with him and feeling that my hand had just been swallowed. It was an enormous hand, and yet, as we see from the drawings and everything that we will look at, has an enormous sense of restraint and elegance that obviously he was able to control beautifully. But I love the photograph, and in Dominique, thank you very much for sharing.
Fingers like two of mine, if I can get them in the anyway.
Say what?
And fingers are like two of mine, and still he was able to play passages, evening concerts that were really so sensitive and delicate.
Very true. Let's look at the next clip if we can. That's great. Thank you.
What is that? Ah, I see. Yeah.
Just so people will know, the subtitles were helping, because I think the voiceover, or the voice itself, is in Swedish, which would limit our understanding. also, one of the things I remember is that, and we'll see later still lifes, is that they would travel, or even when he was at home, when there were inclement days, he would do still lifes. And we'll have an opportunity later to see some of those still life images, both in dry point for the most part. We're here watching him essentially create in charcoal. And the filming of it is really quite wonderful, because it provides us with an opportunity to be part of essentially work in progress, as if we're with him as it is being made. So it's really quite a very successful film, I think, that we are able to show in the gallery for people on a full-time basis, so that they can just simply quietly enjoy Gunnar making pieces that have brought us so much pleasure and delight over these many years.
What I'm completely struck by these films, and I'm not quite sure whether it's because the resolution it's an older film,
yes,
put onto electronic and then moved, so it's been through 2 or 3 iterations, but by how much the landscape is, I mean, it's not just about the structure of the landscape, how it is coming across on my screen. It's as if the creators of the film figured out how to mimic his drawing style. The resolution is low enough and smudgy enough. I find it quite extraordinary.
Yep, that's a wonderful point. Let's look at the next image if we can, Caroline. Thank you so much. So as I mentioned at the very outset, together with Rusty Herbert, who's been working with us, we selected some poems that were in the public domain to juxtapose with some of the images. And I've asked Mara, who apparently was part of her high school training was to read poetry, to read the Robert Frost poem as we look at the piece, and then let's talk about it.
Well, for Mr. Warren in high school and Father Larkin at Boston College, let's hope I can remember my training well enough. I'll try it on the screen because then my eyes are up. Robert Frost, Into My Own. One of my wishes is those dark trees, so old and firm they scarcely show the breeze, were not, as 'twere, the merest mask of gloom, but stretched away into the edge of doom. I should not be withheld, but that someday into their vastness I should steal away, fearless of ever finding open land or highway where the slow wheel pours the sand. I do not see why I e'er turn back, or those should not set forth upon my track to overtake me, who should miss me here and long to know if I still held them dear. They would not find me changed from him they knew, only more sure of all I thought was true.
I think your training paid off. Thank you so much. What a lovely way to experience the image itself. Andy and Dominique, would you speak a bit about this particular image?
What?
I would like first to say an anecdote of when we were in Portugal together. And we were in a little village with a very simple white church. And Gunnar was standing in front of that church and tracing it with his hand over and over, as if he was trying to get a kinetic memory of how to render that church on a rainy day, as Bernard said. So that was interesting to see part of how he works. And another lovely anecdote of his piano playing, we were in a posada, and it was an old castle of Santa Isabella. And there was a piano in the living room, and Gunnar started playing that piano in the living room, and people from the hotel started gathering in the living room, and it was a magic moment indeed. So that is not related to this image, no, but it was wonderful memories. And
thank you. Andy, just respond to the image just a teeny bit?
Yes, well, to me, the most interesting part of this image is the foreground tree that's split in two, where you have that line of light that keeps bringing you back to that tree, and then you start off to the left of the image or to the right, which is more remote. And that, it's counterintuitive to have that there, but to me, that's a minor manifestation of his genius, because I think if you fill that tree in, it's much less use in exploring the image. And you see, certain arbitrariness of dark and light, but it makes for very harmonious breakdown of the sectors. And your eye just moves back and forth. It's hard to relate directly to music, but there's something in the rhythm that brings music to mind.
Very much so, even like piano keys in a way, in terms of the light and dark keys, the black and white keys. But there is a visual rhythm that comes through for me in looking at the piece. I'm always grateful for these opportunities to see it on a screen and somehow isolate it from the rest of the world. Another quote that I would share, and then we can look at another clip, is art transcends the limitation of time and time's concerns. And I feel that very much so as I enter into this collection of trees or small forested area of Gunnar's, where time's concerns and the real world that we're living in evaporate in a very important way, so that it provides a sense of rest and beauty. Let's look at the next clip, if you would, Carolyn. Okay.
Yeah.
We skipped.
Yeah, I think so too, but this is just as good. So Andy, do you want to talk just a little bit over this?
Well, he's doing a dry point here, which is different from etching. You have no acid, you go directly into the plate. It's kind of midway between engraving and etching. You hold the tool as you would a pen to write with. And it's very demanding. I mean, the slightest difference in pressure makes an immediate difference on the plate. So it takes some time to get used to. And of course, Gunnar, having done so many, he got to be virtuosic in his ability. And he would set up his plates with that screen that diffuses the light that many print artists use. And he worked mostly on small plates. Occasionally he would tackle a large one. And when he was all done, they would turn around in the same space behind them and print with the, when I say they, there's Ulla in the background, and she was ever present and integral to the process, not marking the plate, of course, but virtually everything after.
He also references the importance of the artist, or in this case, his helpmate, printing the prints rather than simply doing a single print and then giving it over to a printer. The intimacy of having him or Ulla or both of them so intimately involved with the creation of each piece. And now I think we can look at the still life dry point, because it certainly exemplifies many of the things that dry point can do, with both a sense of quietude and elegance. Mara, any thoughts?
This has that same Interesting that you said Zen or Buddhist quality earlier, Dominique, knowing him. But the minute I saw this, I was struck by how you sort of start in the middle with a conscious mind and you float out to the edges into this liminal or subconscious world. You're highly focused and then you move out. And I mean, yes, it is a still life, and in some ways it's a very straightforward still life, but on another level, there's this moving from consciousness to subconsciousness, or or starting with a central heartbeat and then moving out into the breath, an inhale or an exhale, or that is timeless in some ways, and about eternity in another way. I find it incredibly beautiful piece in a very quiet way, but a very deep way.
Timeless is a good description. They're so delicately rendered, those plums. They're almost transparent, and there's a spiritual quality to them. They're real but not real. And
well, you also have to. This is a 4.5 by 5.5 image. I mean, the paper size is obviously larger. It is very quiet, but there's a sort of amplitude of spirit, and to think. I mean, we're seeing it much on my computer screen, and people have a large computer screen. You're seeing it in a way that belies its intimacy and yet its monumentality.
it's about a quarter to a third larger than its real size on my screen.
Interesting. Yeah, I had also printed out about to scale, and it's quite wonderful. And also brings to mind the following quote of Thomas's: doing something out of duty is fine, but doing it out of love is divine. So when Mara suggested the sense of both the common and infinite quality of this piece, the notion of divine in a more general sense with a small d, not a large d in this case, makes it spectacular in a quiet way.
Can I make one other observation?
Sure, absolutely.
You almost don't notice it, but there's quite a bit of modulation under the fruit. So subtle, you would have to be, I can't point to it because you can't see me, but on the table, which you virtually don't notice except for the horizontal line in the back on the left, there is shadow from these fruit objects, but it's so delicate, it's almost subliminal. And it's all done with line. There's no, aquatint or method. There's no surface process that makes that delicate shading. It's all done with tiny lines.
Wonderful. Let's look at the next piece if we can. There you go. And this sort of brings back the video clip we looked at before in terms of the rich dark areas that Mara referred to. And Mara, do you want to chat a bit about this one? Because I think it's rather extraordinary.
This is so incredibly modern. In how abstracted he's made the front bushes, and he's merged them with the taller trees on the hillsides that are more representational than the smaller bushes. This ridge. This again, I feel like it's weighted with the landscape, and it's weighted with the darkest darks that a landscape can be in that sort of a damp forest. It's only 2.5 by 3.25 inches.
Right.
And yet, I mean, I'm just struck by how he can, in this very small space, really, compared to what we're seeing here, can convey such a range of scale and depth and complexity of composition. And then when you really start focusing in and you start looking, the touch, every single touch from the cross hatching to little teeny dot matrix to little feathering that he's doing with his I'm trying to remember what the name of the stylus is, down to how he must have furrowed and textured these darker blob shapes, the bushes or the foreground trees. And I mean, Andy can talk a bit more about how each choice he made and each nick he made and how he incised or lifted the substructure created these darks for him to ink.
Dry point is a technique where you can get the most delicate silvery lines by obviously not incising deeply. But when you incise with some strength, you make a deeper furrow. And that, where does the metal that you've removed go? It makes a little like heads on the side of the road, a little, it's called the burr, and it holds the ink so that it permits the dry point artist to go from almost imperceptible to very, very strong, because that burr holds the ink and makes a dark black. And in this image, obviously, he's used that burr quite a bit while still defining the trees, the branches in the distance. And then he adds, to bring you forward, there's 6 kind of round objects in the front around. Bushes? Well, the top 4 are bushes, but it's hard to explain the bottom 2, the one to the left in the middle of what ostensibly is a path and the one closest to us. It's hard to integrate them factually into that landscape. And it's almost an abstraction to move your eye to the middle of the image before you move out again. So dry point permits this kind of range, and Gunnar is exploiting it, the dark range.
The other reminder I would suggest, and we have in the past included in the gallery, is the drawings of Seurat. There's a beautiful exhibition done at the Museum of Modern Art, and we have the catalog to share with people. But certainly that, rather than arbitrary pointillist approach, comes through in Gunnar's works in a much less rigid way and adds to the lights and darks, the shading and the gradations that appear in virtually every one of his pieces that are in the show, especially these dry points with the rich blacks. The next image is one that brings great pleasure to me and to many of us, which was an exhibit here in Boston. Andy on the left, Anita Sherwood, who was part of the gallery for 37 years, and then Ulla and Gunnar. Any memories, Andy, of that moment? And then I want to say some things about Anita.
That was a wonderful vernissage opening, and Gunnar and Ulla were, as you can see, at least in Ulla's case, radiating. And obviously I was quite satisfied. And you put the, it was both a great show and a great event because of the hospitality and warmth to which the Normans were obviously very sensitive. And Anita was a joy at the time, anyway.
Anita was part of the gallery and the family for the 37 years that she was at the gallery, and brought such a deep and profound commitment to the art and the artists and to every visitor. She brought her sense of Southern welcoming and charm and grace and beauty to that experience. And for me, it's always an opportunity just to say thank you to her. She's still very much part of our lives, and hopefully we are hers, but a real tribute to her for her grace that she really shared with the gallery and created amongst the staff as well, a sense of family. So all of those who worked with her over the almost 4 decades were her kidlets, and nurtured them and enabled each of them to be as good or better than they ever thought they could be. So
I'm going to add a word that you may not know.
Yeah.
I graduated from college in '77, and I had been a theater major, but it was in those 4 years that I lived in Boston on Charles Street that I started going to all the galleries that were then located all along Newbury Street, and going to the Institute for Contemporary Art, and really switching over from theater arts to visual art. And one of the things my whole life I've worked against is what I call the black turtleneck crowd, who hold the art world as something so precious. And if you have to ask about this, then I was a kid. I was a 21-year-old who knew something about, I had good basic training in London at the Victoria and Albert Museum. Every contemporary art museum, or modern art museum, gallery, excuse me, on Newbury Street that I walked in, no one talked to me except at your gallery.
And there was Anita.
It's always been a favorite of mine, even before we met.
Wonderful. What a nice story. And it is I actually came across a mission statement that I wrote when we opened in '67. And part of it had to do with the emphasis on welcome and on education. And Anita was a great, great part of the welcome and of the education. And it grew out of a genuineness and an integrity and authenticity of her love of art that made the gallery that much more welcoming. So thank you for saying that. I had no idea, and I certainly didn't remember you in 1977. I'm sorry. Let's look at the next clip.
Can I make a minor observation for that picture?
Sure. I think she can. Yeah, they are.
Yeah. You see that they're more or less jammed together there, and that wasn't just for the photo. They moved almost as a unit, and they spoke almost as a unit,
Yes.
finishing one another's sentences.
Wow.
They were as much a team as any couple I've encountered.
Lovely. Thank you for adding that.
Oh, he's trying to press. Okay.
Yes, yeah. In the early years of the gallery, we did have something called Pucker Press, which Claudia LeMay was the lead person there, both in helping people create etchings and then helping them print it. And it was at our old frame shop on, I think, North Washington Street, where it was. So seeing this press brings back wonderful memories of her involvement as well. And she was one of Anita's kidlets.
Yeah.
Any comments as she's printing, Andy?
Pardon?
Any comments as they're printing?
Yes, they printed obviously with great care, but very small editions because the copper plate, unless it's treated with a process that hardens it, the copper plate wears down, and they were very sensitive to loss of image eventual. So you get, I would say their average edition, he did many, many prints, but probably he produced actual sheets with artwork at a very average rate of an artist who would do one-tenth the number of images, but would do them in editions of 100, which is common. His edition, I guess the average would be 20. In some cases, one of my favorite still lifes was an edition of 4, and I worked mightily to obtain one. So great attention to the printing. It's one thing. One of the observations for that, we had one other artist very important to our gallery in Paris who worked very closely with a printer who became quite celebrated as a printer, became a French national treasure, blah, blah. And I said to Gunnar, you know, if you didn't print them, if you tried using another printer, you'd have more time to create. And he pretty much brushed me off, but eventually let me try it and gave me a plate to send down to Paris for a trial run. And it hit me between the eyes. I mean, there was no comparison. And this was a good printer. But what Gunnar was able to extract from his plate with his hand rubbing and modulating, he could get just what he wanted and nobody else could, obviously.
There is a time and a place for everything, but it reminds me very much of how the world has sped up, and in the process of speeding up has lost its soul. And much what you're saying is his ability to commit to each of the prints his own spirit, and then that gets shared. Today, the notion of being able to multiply, do things at a rapid rate, has lost the ability, one, to do it, or the desire to do it, and two, I'm afraid it's also taken from many young people the ability to appreciate that. So the goal of these conversations is to encourage people to look carefully and appreciate the care with which the art itself was created. This is a wonderful example, not a print, but a drawing. And look just at both the composition, the design, the subtlety, and at which point I give it to Mara.
Well, the first thing I'm struck with is the quality of light on the water. It's low tide, clearly, and it's calm. You know, there's slack winds out there, and the light is has turned the surface of the water to glass. But he did it, you know, usually you put your darkest darks next to your lightest lights to create that kind of blaze of sun. There's hardly a dark in this entire piece. It's almost as if he can whisper an image into life.
That is beautifully said. Thank you so much. You can keep talking, but I just wanted to call out that.
I grew, you know, I was born in Boston, but raised on Cape Cod.
Okay.
And this is the absolute peace that the Nantucket Sound gives me. And I know it's a completely different body of water and a completely different time. But that, it's like an Agnes Martin with all of her little pencil lines. It is that quality of calm, that attention by the sea in the smallest ripple brings you. I could feel my pulse lower looking at this piece. I can feel my relationship to, I'm going to use that word again, and it's a small s, to the spiritual happens in this piece. So it's like an altar.
I think we should look at the next one and not even go there. Thank you so much for saying that about the piece.
And this might be even more so. This has less information in it in terms of place. And, you know, and time of day and people on the beach with one, I'm reminded of, God, I think it's Alfred Lord Tennyson, crossing the bar, and I shall see my maker's face when I cross the bar. It's just like anyone who, for me, has gone to the sea, but I'm sure other people who grew up in mountains or grew up in other, sort of special places and really paid attention to the quietude and expansiveness of the universe writ small and writ large at the same time. This is a piece that's an elegy for life itself.
And again is 8 by 11. Andy and Dominique?
So, well, what I would say is that by drawing our attention to the quality of light on the sand and on the water and the sun behind the mist, what he has offered us is forever after, when we see a landscape, a seascape, we will think that looks like a Norman. He will have gave us a way of seeing the world that it's a surprise, but we'll recognize it.
That's true.
And forever we will think, this is a Norman. When we walk by the sea, when we see a boat reflecting on quiet water, when we see the air through the branch of a tree, this is a Norman.
Can I add a footnote to that?
Please.
Because both this and the preceding image, you see almost a merging of the sand and the sea. Loma, South Sweden and Loma in particular are totally flat, and the land does merge, not abruptly, but not on these long passages of kind of water, kind of land, and that I'm missing the word, but anyway, that informs a lot of Gunnar's seascapes. This is near his home, and that's the way it looks, except for the poetry.
So I have a question. If this is my eyes looking at a screen, or is it truly, I mean, it's magic to me that it happens, is the sun almost in the gentlest way, almost modulates in and out of the picture, as if I'm seeing it in real time.
Yep.
I don't know whether it's on the screen or whether it does that in person.
It depends how much coffee you've had, but I think you're absolutely right. It kind of comes in and out of the image in such a beautiful way. One quote, and then we'll move on to another clip, which is, "Take joy in the beautiful, the good and the true. Always pursue what unites and does not divide." And I think that the conversation so far, and certainly with this piece, and what Dominique has said, is that for all of us, it provides us with that opportunity to really enjoy and appreciate that which is beautiful in the world around us, no matter where we are, as long as we are attuned to the glasses created by Gunnar Norrman to look through. So let's look at the next clip, please. You want to talk a bit, Andy, about his father-in-law, I believe, who was a professor of botany?
That's how he met Ulla.
Yeah, it was Ulla's father, yes, wasn't it?
It was Ulla's father when he was a student with Ulla's father in botany.
Yes.
And
So,
I suppose to say about that.
well,
No.
the fact that he'd better get the plants right.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
absolutely. He was, he could have been a professional botanist. I tell the story of when we went to the botanical garden in Brooklyn with Ulla and Gunnar. And he went off the path and up to some exotic plant and murmured its Latin name and fondled the leaves. I mean, there was such a knowledge and intimacy between him and the natural.
Very much. There's a sense of the joy that both of them felt in nature certainly comes through in the work that he has created. This pencil drawing gives us another opportunity, I think, to simply reflect on the gift of his art. Mara, your thoughts?
It's just from a technical standpoint, to have the kind of touch that he has to create that delicate tracery of the twig level of the tree. And the surety, I mean, you saw him doing his sweeping lines across. The surety of his touch, how he is going, he has a vision, and interesting that you said something about him tracing the church over and over so he could figure out how he was going to render it. But once he made his decision, the confidence and the surety and the calmness by which he built up his shades, which created the form, or drew his forms and then lightened as he went to the edge, so that the energy, the pulse of the living tree moves out and dissolves in front of you. It's incredibly masterful work for people who, I know story or plot, narrative of a piece is what we first go to. Oh, it looks just like it's supposed to look. But for those of you or us who are interested in how deftly a touch can be made, or the technical prowess of an artist, the surety, the mastery, this man is extraordinarily gifted on a technical level.
And that doesn't show, which is very nice. When you are presented with a virtuoso violinist and all you're aware of is technique, there is no soul. The nice thing is that what appears and what is shared here is the spiritual, soulful quality of the pieces, and it's made possible because in place is the technical. And that's a wonderful gift, I think, for all of us. Andy and Dominique?
Well, I would say that there are three roots to Gunnar's personality. There is the music, there is the botany, and there is the art. And what reunites them is Gunnar's beautiful mystical spirit. So,
but Mara is right to emphasize the technical.
Yeah,
it's not because he's showing off. It's integral to the vision of the image, where he's making you see the trees close in such detail that the ones that are faintly adumbrated in the distance, you read the same kind of detail into them, even though in some cases they're barely a smudge of a pencil. So there's an intention to his granularity. That's not the word, but anyway, the fine detail that he achieves, both in his prints and drawings.
Well said. Let's look one more clip and then another image.
working.
And the text is very meaningful in this, it seems, to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
Because you know, in other hands, it could be almost corny, but in his, again, it's spiritual, it's true.
Absolutely. So we have the last image, and there are a couple of quotes that I wanted to share at the end, but I think the image itself also provides us with an opportunity just to have one more go at astonishment. So Mara?
Again, there's a specificity to this work. And it is what we would say realism. And yet there is such a pulse of abstraction that is so thoroughly modern. I mean, I sort of feel like this is a person whose artistic vision reaches back to Rembrandt and yet moves forward to Franz Kline. And that's an odd thing to say about a 6 by 7.5 inch painting, but
Right.
There's that pulse of energy that comes together in this, and then there's this, you know, odd staccato movement of the piers that are broken down in some way. You know, the rotting piers or whatever it happens to be in that foreground, and that complete shifting of scale within this tiny little plate is, I mean, it's just extraordinary to me. I find this work fascinating because there's an ineffable quality to it, but it's grounded in something that we know, we can smell. The tide is out. We can smell the tide. We can smell the brine. We can, in his landscapes, we can feel the mist on our face. They're incredibly tactile, and yet there's this quality of spirituality that I think it's extraordinary work. I have to say, I completely fallen in love with this man's work.
Andy?
Well,
Dominique.
this is related to his Swedish seascapes, but it's actually in
France.
southern France. And, you know, the way he has these 3 horizontals, the 2 strong ones enclosing detail, and then way off in the distance, the suggested third land.
The far horizon.
Yeah. It's constructed of horizontals and verticals almost entirely, but out of them comes a sense of space and distance that's created almost despite them. I mean, the detail would enclose you in the foreground, but somehow you're drawn to that faint background after you explore the foreground. I guess that's
very helpful. No, it's very helpful. Let me just end with a couple of, first, thank you to the 3 of you and to Caroline as well for making this possible and allowing us to have an opportunity to look more carefully into Gunnar's work, to share a couple of comments, one of which is that Andy and Dominique, your devotion to Gunnar and Ulla, not only to their art, but to them as people, and your abiding sense of friendship for them is a joy simply to behold. One of the all-time pleasures of the gallery are those friendships with very special people. And I think we both have benefited from those with many, many of the artists that we've worked with. But this is a wonderful example of a shared joy of friendship that you and they shared. And then I would add just finally another quote from Thomas that seems to help summarize in many ways. We are not material beings on a spiritual journey, but spiritual beings on a material journey. And certainly the material of Gunnar's work has allowed us into his spiritual presence in his art and in our lives that has made it all the better in such a tumultuous universe that we confront almost on a daily basis. So gratitude to one and all for participating in this, for sharing with us, and hopefully for enjoying the work of Gunnar Norrman. Thank you all, and good afternoon or good morning, whatever it may be, wherever you are.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so
You're
much.
welcome.
Thank you.